Hi, welcome back to my channel. I want to do a video on how toxic relationships don't work, and it's something that I've literally had to kind of learn through life, trial and error, long periods of time spent. I didn't think this was something that helped me learn it, but kind of unnecessary time spent in sort of toxic dynamics where feeling stuck and traumatized, and just not feeling the ability to leave, or just stuck in this, be that. And I think I have a lot of compassion for myself, because sometimes like you're stuck, be that in your mind, or your body for a start. Trauma is stored in your physical body and also in your mind as well. But you can be stuck in physical situations as well, be that a living situation, or financial dependence, emotional dependence. Toxic people love to create dependency within you so they can keep drawing you back into their grasp and using you as a tool to regulate themselves. But I thought on this, I don't like to talk about upbringing very often, because I know it's something very personal to each person, and it is also personal to me as a person. But I do want to touch on how adverse childhood effects, being influenced by psychopaths, can have a massive impact on your current situation. Be that how you have adapted to be at this point, or how you have, I'm sorry, I need to plug in my laptop, how you've adapted to be as a person, or how you have, I need to go and plug in my laptop one sec. So, as I was saying, you can build core beliefs from very, very, very young primal ages that can be built on and actually carried into adulthood, based on toxic behaviour and just sort of survival. Things like, I'm going to talk about this in a sec, but I do want to first talk about psychopathic influence as a child, and how that can influence yourself in various ways to make sense of reactions you might have or still have if you have contact with those people now. But just also at the end as well, or at some point, I'm going to talk about how, for example, if you have like a belief that like if an adult is inconsistent, that's really scary to a child. Like, our needs are so different as children than they are as adults. Like, if an adult seems uninterested as an adult, and being an adult, I think I've heard is about being accountable for the everything you do, be that good or bad, and that you then therefore have the ability to make the choices you have, even if you feel really overwhelmed or really stressed out, or whatever. As a child, we're a lot more obviously vulnerable and dependent through the fact we're literally unable to know even how to do these things ourselves, and we have a lot more of a limited contrast to actually compare to. So as a child, if you are like neglected in a really small way, or you're kind of forgotten about in some small way, that's a terrifying thing for a child, because it means that they feel like they could die, because a child is so vulnerable, especially a baby is so vulnerable, that that small gap of time or that level of neglect can be extremely terrifying and life-threatening to a child, through their survival instincts. And so therefore, if you have this core belief, especially if you're then trained, shall I say, to actually be dependent on a toxic parent. I did some work on this as well, how toxic parents are, like, if you have a toxic parent or a godlike parent, they love it when I need to, I need to get my notes, actually, to be honest, because it is worth talking about, because I do come across some really interesting information. on the internet. They are all from, qualified people, but it was an idea of how godlike parents are like they actually believe they're like a god, to an extent, like in their minds. Godlike parents that are narcissistic, for example, they do have the opinion and they act as if they're like basically godlike. Okay, so I can't find the document actually. I must have not saved it, but godlike parents that you have this like fear, like it's kind of a blaspheme mentality of godlike parents that walk around like if you are to disappoint them, you have this awful sense of like I believe we're all connected to source energy in some form of God source to some extent, be that through any sort of religion or just a sense of self, core energy, whatever. And godlike parents, it's a level of narcissism, and it comes from a level of godlike parents will trick their children or condition their children into treating them like a god, basically, or God themselves. It says in the Bible, do not put false gods. Do not, like, it's one of the 10 Commandments, like, don't have false gods and false idols. But we're not getting, like, overly religious here. But it's a case of, this is how people can use religious manipulation as well, to actually say, like, I wish I had the document because I listened to a whole podcast on it, but it's like godlike parents, they will put forward this idea of if you challenge them, like you might feel like it's this sense of they're all powerful and you're very weak, and then you wonder why you've got this weak mentality towards like life or people, or this like default setting of like weakness because you've been conditioned in that way and told you were that way. And all of our thoughts are like valid, like often it comes from like a real, obviously logical place, but you might just be like, why am I not assertive? And it's like because you've been conditioned in this godlike way, from a parent or a caregiver that told you, like, that made you feel as if they were all powerful and you were weak, or they were all smart and you were all stupid, as in like you would, because toxic people and toxic caregivers also like to keep you dependent on them. They'll train you to discard your own sense of intuition, right and wrong, belief system, in order to actually go to them, in order to actually feel validated and only believe that they are like, like godlike and like you should go to them. I believe it's a sense of blaspheme because God is like the only God we have and people aren't gods, people are people and we are all equal at the end of the day. It also makes you feel like they're big and you're small, kind of like, I don't know why I'm going to bring this in, but like Matilda and like, Miss Trunchbull, and she's like, I'm big, you're small, I'm right, you're wrong. Or no, it's the dad in Matilda. Don't know why I brought that up, but it's kind of that sense of, if you've seen that, where he's like belittling Matilda and stuff. I don't know why I bring that up, but it's that sense of like, narcissism and entitlement and sort of, because they genuinely believe they're like godlike. It's a sense of narcissism, from a logical sense that I can understand, and it also gives you this massive fear because I believe like we all intrinsically have this fear of like a god or whatever, be that source energy or whatever, and there's if you believe in a higher power or whatever, and godlike parents will put this sense of fear into you, like if you disobey them, and if they're toxic, disobeying them is literally doing anything, finding autonomy, doing things you want to do that don't suit their narcissistic extension of themselves. I don't want to get like too deep into narcissists now, but they see everyone as a narcissistic extension of themselves and a tool to actually manipulate and regulate themselves. They don't love the other person, they love themselves. So when they say I love you, they actually mean they love themselves, but anyway, that's something else. So when they instill this fear into you of like, if you disobey them, it's like disobeying God, and there's this awful circumstance which they will often like actually impend on you, as a punishment that they feel because they feel godlike, or they believe they're godlike, they will actually, I believe we're making the image of God, but I don't think God berates us for autonomy. And this is the perversion of the whole thing, and how even in the Bible it says to, honour your parents. But I believe, and I'm coming to the idea of like, you can honour your parents without, and I don't even like the word honour because I'm past honouring them, but it's a case of like, you can actually, I just don't think toxic relationships work. Like, if one person's toxic, it's going to be a toxic relationship. And it's so important to actually come to the realisation that toxic relationships don't work, and it's not your fault. Toxic people will condition you in a way to actually make you feel as if you are like the one that is causing the issue, because toxic people obviously can't take accountability. And I'm going to talk about psychopathy in a minute to actually validate this kind of stuff. But before I do that, I feel like I've literally done it the opposite way to what I thought, but let's just do it anyway. Trauma is seen as anything that is too overwhelming to process at the time. So trauma can be like a car accident, it can be a sexual assault, and they are traumatic things, and that is trauma. But at the same time, trauma is actually seen as anything too overwhelming to process, and it can be stored in the pit of your subconscious, and the resistance compounds over time to suppress trauma. So one of our like core coping mechanisms as human beings is to repress. There's several others. I've done a video on coping mechanisms actually, or like primal coping mechanisms. You get lots of them, but one of them is repression. And often when you are triggered in any sort of trauma, like I always talk about narcissists being triggered because I talk about narcissists a lot sometimes, but you can be triggered as a healthy person, non-narcissistically, just from a trauma you've experienced. Obviously, narcissists aren't the only people who get triggered, and you can, I've heard in the past, when you do have a sense of CPTSD or just past trauma where you are triggered in a situation, when you actually recognise the trigger, you can actually heal it and reintegrate it into yourself. Because often when we repress things, it can be that we're ridiculed for some part of ourselves that we then push away. We disown that part of ourselves because we see that as a threat to our survival or to our, socialisation. So we discard that part of ourselves and we repress that part of ourselves. Or, which can be adaptive for periods, but long term, like repressing sides of yourself isn't healthy. And obviously when it comes to traumatic events as well, obviously you can just repress the whole thing, like, oh, it didn't happen. If it's too overwhelming for you, you will push it away and push it down and say, oh, it didn't happen. If this continues, not only is it really bad for your mental health, and you can have like issues, even in the mental health system they used to talk about the stress bucket of, if you repress too many things, you shove loads of stuff in your stress bucket, it will overflow, and that will mean obviously different things for different people depending on what you're prone to. But it can be depression, it can be anxiety, and a variety of other things in between CPTSD and obviously PTSD and blah blah blah. They're adaptive mechanisms for your mind to cope with overflow, or just, kind of try and process that it gets stuck. And this is called your pain body when you are re-traumatized, not re-traumatized, that's something different. When you are triggered, it can be your pain body. That actually, I've got a song called Pain Body as well, because I learned over lockdown that your body stores trauma. Your mind can rationalise it and be great for working it out at times, but your body actually stores the trauma within your cells and within your muscles and everything, and that's your pain body, which is why I'm a massive advocate for somatic healing and EFT, which is where you say an emotion and tap these parts of your body to release it. There's more images on Google if you type in EFT trauma therapy. It's very easy, just engages your emotional body. So yeah, when you have a pain body response though, in terms of being triggered temporarily, you can have a disproportionate response to the reality, especially if you have like many layers repressing something. Because our minds are so adaptive, and our bodies are so adaptive. And it can be like, as I said, an adaptive quality. Like if you're managing someone or you're interacting with someone that is toxic, that you literally want to smack in the face, I'm not gonna lie, repressing that temporarily could keep you out of prison, for example. You know what I mean? But once you endure long-term trauma or childhood trauma that you literally haven't had time to process properly, it can keep you in toxic relationships and in a sense of like prolonged depression or anxiety, where you're sort of disconnected from the core root of the actual depression, especially if you're not sort of in tune with your instinctual reaction and your intuitive reaction. You might sort of be more either discarding of your emotions, or you actually might intellectualize your emotions, like, oh, I don't feel that great today, maybe I'll just go for a run, do you know what I mean? Project it onto something else, that sort of thing. So yeah, but recognizing what you're triggered by can actually help you work on the trauma, and your emotions and your triggers do actually have a functional mechanism to help you say and like pinpoint what it is that you are actually protected from, and what the danger is that your body and your mind is trying to actually register to you. But being in tune with your intuition is great, because it can mean that your mind hasn't caught up to you yet, or you've got a lot of repression and layers on top of that repression that keep you from experiencing that core issue. Your body is actually aware of it. So you might, it can be things like, you know, if you get into a car accident and you then get into a car, if it was really traumatizing to you. I had this where in school I had the school bus radiator explode, and it was when I felt like we were driving past a fire. And just before the radiator exploded, there was a massive amount of smoke that came out the back of the bus. It doesn't sound like a big thing, but it was. The bus filled with smoke. I got a burn on my foot. Like there was hot water like pouring out of a radiator that exploded in the back of this really, you know, questionable bus. But anyway, I was driving in a car later on, and I smelt smoke because we were driving past a fire, and I had a sort of panic sort of moment, meltdown, like we need to stop the car, we need to stop the car, like it's, you know, the radiator's going to explode, the radiator's going to explode, like something's going to explode. You know what I mean? You have that overwhelming reaction, which might be out of proportion to what is actually happening at that time, because it wasn't. We were just driving past the smoke, but in my mind, that was what was happening. And that was kind of an example of the pain body response. But obviously when I then realised we were driving past smoke, I kind of laugh about it and be like, okay, right, well, yeah, that makes sense. And then obviously I actually did get triggered a few times after that, to be honest. When driving past smoke, I had to check the back of the car. I had to check, like, obviously like not stop the car, but I had to look out the back for the back of the car to make sure there was no smoke, and just check around and make sure, like, you know, we were actually driving past a fire, and the car wasn't going to explode and the radiator wasn't going to explode in the car. But it's also about evaluating your core beliefs in your subconscious as well, because of this sense of repression that we have. If you are well, I haven't talked about psychopaths yet. I might have to section this, but I do think often it can be very helpful generally. So if you want to watch it, they will, and if they don't, then they won't. But there we go. I won't try and ramble on unnecessarily, but it is the truth that core beliefs are stored in our subconscious, and if you feel that a situation is not socially acceptable for you to actually express yourself at that time, aka you repress it, it goes and gets stored into your subconscious. And that's where a lot of stuff, and when we act, 95% of our thoughts and our actions are subconscious. So even if you're not aware that you are really intimidated by someone, even, like some people are so, cognitive dissonance is a real thing, and it can be really adaptive, for example. But even if you actually repress a sense of anger towards someone, or any sort of strong emotion, it is actually being registered in your subconscious. You know, and can, the brain naturally, as a child and as an adult, likes to make sense of situations. So if you feel very irritated and angry by a person, and then you find that you're irritated and angry after a conversation with them, but you don't register the link to the conversation with the person, you can be like, oh, I'm just an angry, bitter person, for example, and you can rationalise that sense of genuine, you know, reaction for some reason that you have, be that, you know, because you're angry at them for doing something. It's different if it's like an out of proportion reaction or you've got the wrong idea about them, but often, you know, with toxic people, they're extremely aggravating and they're very difficult to deal with and they're very infuriating because of their very nature. So it's about being in touch with that and validating yourself, because if you've been invalidated chronically as a childhood, you're not in childhood, you might not, you know, necessarily validate yourself to the extent that you should or deserve to be as an adult even, and it's about learning that as a healthy adult and integrating that, like, ability even, because sometimes people don't even have it. So your perception is limited as a child, and basically when it comes to believing things, you look at how certain a person is, how aligned they are, and how much authority they have, and if you feel like all of those things are true, you will accept a truth even if it's not true. So if that comes from a parent and they look very certain of themselves and they look like they're sort of calm and aligned and they're a sense of authority by nature to you, because of your age range and whatever, you will accept a truth even if it's not true. So if you know people can be all sorts of manipulated as children depending on what happens, and it doesn't just have to be in children. This can happen in adulthood as with players and stuff. You know, players will try and romantic players and player types, they'll try and trick you into believing all sorts of things about them and about their, you know, way of being, and condition you in certain ways and look very confident about it and even believe to an extent sometimes what they're saying. But it can be very, you know, it can be very confusing if you believe what they're saying is truth and take what they're saying as truth when it's actually not truth, and you've just been sort of confused into this. It's even a theory in psychology, when I did psychology in college, how it's this obedience study. So if someone is in like a police uniform, you're much more likely to comply with what they're saying than someone just from the general public. It's just the way that we are made and adapted in society, because it's just how it is. There was a study on it and that was the finding. Sorry, just putting my food everywhere. So yes, basically the idea of when you have beliefs as a child, you can build on those beliefs and they can crumble like Jenga when you actually dismantle your core beliefs that you've made as a survival technique. Oh dear. As a survival technique, you know, you can, if you feel neglected by your parents, and you may well have been neglected by your parents, but it's a case of, if you were neglected, you can have this sense of, I need to, which can carry on to childhood, adulthood, I need to put my godlike parent in front of myself, show them and prove to them that I am, you know, putting them in this godlike position, validating them above my own needs, repressing my own needs, being blindly compliant to their needs, because that's what godlike parents and toxic parents want, because they build this core identity around being a parent and it's a threat to their identity. Children actually hold a lot of the power, especially as an adult, to take away that sense of ego protection that a parent is trying to protect instinctually, because when a toxic person becomes a parent, their belief that they're trying to protect is that they are, you know, it's the sad, frightening, disturbing truth of, they don't want you to grow. They want you to be forever dependent on them. If you grow and you individuate, it's a threat to their sense of control, their sense of dominance over you, their sense of being able to regulate themselves through you, and and control you and feel more in control of their lives. They don't want you to, they want you to be small, they want you to be malleable to them so they can control you. And they really do not want you to individuate. And it's the sad, scary truth, and the disturbing truth, as I said, but it's so important to bear that in mind. It's an instinctual thing. Often, whether they don't want to admit it or not, some people have argued that parents do, to some extent, want the best thing for their young, but because they're toxic within their nature, they cannot allow you to individuate or they will not allow you to individuate because it's a threat to themselves. So they'll sabotage you. They will do, they will, and you might think, why don't I have a solid sense of self? Because that wasn't validated and mirrored to you as a child. Why don't I have good self-esteem? Because your self-esteem is consistently criticised as a child, that, you were constantly ripped down to keep you in subservience to a toxic parent or a toxic adult caregiver that wanted to have control and dominance over you because of, obviously, their toxic patterns in narcissism. I don't really want to go into everything now, and I am going to go into psychopathy in a minute. But it's a sense of narcissists need control over other people and like control over other people because they're unable to regulate themselves, and they want to mirror you to other people to kind of take on this sense of soul theft. They want to take on your personality to mirror that to other people in order to get admiration for themselves that they cannot actually have because of their inability to have a solid sense of self, because they're malleable people, because they obviously are just trying to protect themselves because they're so vulnerable in their ego. There's a lot that goes into narcissism. Let's just refer to it as a toxic parent at this point, or a toxic caregiver. So that can just be... It can just be a core belief, and it can stop you from having healthy relationships as well. If your emotional needs weren't met, like with a toxic person, it's a one-way relationship with a toxic person. If you're healthy and they're toxic, they want to meet their own needs and you want to meet their needs because you're a giving person, but you won't receive it back. So it's a one-way relationship. That can be normal to you, and I even wrote this down as a core belief that came from me. You might not even be conscious of it, and that's the whole thing, bringing the subconscious to the conscious. If you've been raised by toxic people and one-way relationships, you can feel it's normal to have a one-way relationship. And a toxic relationship where your emotional needs aren't met, that can just be normal to you, and therefore a reciprocal relationship can be extremely intimidating, because you're actually not used to experiencing that. Even if you have friendships that are functional, even when it comes to equally yoked relationships that are romantic or whatever, it can be an extremely scary concept, and it can keep you looped into toxic relationships with toxic people because that's what you are used to, and your subconscious is programming you to do, it's programmed to do, and it's not something that you should be judging yourself for, but it's just the way that you've been programmed. So yeah, that can be one thing. And people just sometimes they do work from this sort of unaligned, say, unaligned with your higher self, kind of, if you want to get slightly spiritual about it, unaligned with your higher self mentality, because of it's a sense of cognitive dissonance, but it's also if you've had these core beliefs from the age of a week old, and you've just built beliefs on top of them like Jenga blocks, it's extremely it can be a lot to actually pull out that core belief and be like, if I'm not unworthy, because obviously if a parent neglected you, you can have this, mechanism in your mind where you come to the conclusion that you're not worthy of your needs being met. If you take that out of the loop, all of these other beliefs that you've built your life around, and the way that you interact with the world, and the way you see the world, and the way you see yourself, and the way you interact with other people, is all crumbles around you, and it can be extremely... I think this comes from a level of spiritual awakening to an extent, but it gives you an idea of the ideas of who I am. This is what I deserve in life, and you get a ceiling of success through that belief. And anything that kind of is more than that is then not congruent with your identity, the way you see it, and from a law of attraction, You will not strive for anything else that you don't believe you are able to have. And I think this makes sense on a conscious level, but when you really look into it, it's a really detrimental thing when it comes to a sense of being able to counter manifest. And I do think counter manifestation is really real, and it's a sense of no, you should be scared of it, but I think it's a case of like, if we have toxic conditioning in our subconscious, you know, I've heard a sense of, you know, whether you want to believe in law of attraction and manifestation and whatever else, it's a case of we all get what we want. So you can be like, oh, you know, I'm attracting toxic people, but somewhere in your subconscious you may have the belief that if you don't tolerate toxic people, you will die, because as a child, if you didn't validate those toxic people or caregivers, you may have been further neglected or abused, and therefore your life may have been at risk, which is a very, very real thing for a very young child, because children cannot do anything for themselves. Yes, to get... So, yeah. It's just like an idea of even, you know, the ugly duckling sense. Like, if you are surrounded by toxic people who are always dragging your self-esteem down, you can have this core belief of, like, you're ugly, for example, or you're like the ugly duckling of the family. Let's not forget, in the ugly duckling, it became a swan. It wasn't even a duckling in the first place. So I do love that concept. And I do also believe that toxic people change your vibration because of a law of vibration, which is actually a law of physics that exists in the universe. If you're around toxic people, you will blend with them. They will become, you know, higher up. You will become lower down in vibration because of the way that it works, which is why distancing yourself from them is so important. And you may find yourself, if you're dragged back into a relationship with them, your vibration may lower. And you can create a lot more space ditching toxic people. But yeah. So anyway, let's go on to the actual part of this video that I actually came onto it to do. So having said all that, this is how psychopathy from caregivers can affect you in adulthood, or obviously at the time, and validating the confusion that you may have. Bearing in mind, covert narcissists are said to have psychopathic trait, or are known as a fact to have psychopathic tendencies, comorbid to their narcissism, because of the fact narcissists are not, like, psychopathy and covert narcissism are linked deeply to the point where psychopathy is a part of covert narcissism. But there is the dark triad, which often, if you have one of the dark triad traits, you're going to be prevalent in all of them. Psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, which is like mischievous level of wanting to make trouble because of their like need for stimulation. But anyway, these are traits that come with psychopathy, and the way that they, relate to the effect on the abusee or the child. So, in there's 4 sections, and it's antisocial behaviour. That they're put into the way it's written. It's really hard to. It's antisocial behaviour, life, interactions with them, and affective things within the psychopath, I think. And 2 of them create disassociation and 2 of them create conflict. Just to mention, the conflict between your subconscious and your conscious is very real and time consuming and energy consuming to actually process as well, and can also be very ongoing, confusing, and cause a sense of depression because of the overwork that your brain is trying to do to actually mentally understand these situations. And not just depression, anxiety, and just general confusion and sort of lack of productivity in whatever way that means. So, from an interaction level, the psychopathic parent may be charming and manipulative, but this can bring a sense of felt love for the child. So therefore, the child then feels like a sense of love, even though it might not be followed up parallel to what is being said. So the parent can say, I love you, but then act in a very unloving way, because toxic people cannot love. You know, they cannot, they love themselves, but it's always a one-way relationship. So they might sort of promise things like love and you know, say that they feel a sense of love towards the person. Say they feel a sense of love towards the person, but their actions don't align. So this can bring a sense of, as I said, felt love, because they're manipulating but also being charming at the same time. So the next thing, so obviously this also makes you doubt your own reality, especially when there's pathological lying involved. It can help you doubt your sense of reality, because toxic people, I'll get onto this later, they don't take a sense of, they don't take responsibility, but that's in the next portion, which I'll talk about in a minute. But they are pathological liars, all narcissists and toxic people. Narcissists, at least, we're talking about here, psychopathic narcissists and stuff, they're pathological liars, and this can bring a sense of doubting your own reality, because obviously if you believe something but you're told otherwise, especially as a child when you're malleable and vulnerable, even more so as an adult without the discernment, of people validating you, you can doubt your own reality from a very young age. And also I talked about right at the beginning of the video that toxic people love it when you're in compliance to them, and I also talked about in another video how narcissists have this inevitable cage of toxic doubt that they're stuck in because of their false sense of ego that they're consistently trying to put forward to the world. They have this sense of inevitable doubt. They like to make other people doubt themselves in order to validate their sense of doubt, like they're not alone, or they feel some form of, you know, they like to manipulate others to feel like they're more doubtful than the toxic person, so therefore they just feel a sense of relief. So they like you to doubt your own reality. And then along with this, when they have a grandiose sense of self-worth, that's psychological abuse. So when you add all these things together, that creates psychological abuse, because obviously you're being gaslighted, aka there's pathological lying going on, which makes you doubt your own reality, and people are manipulating you, charming you, telling you lies. That's psychological abuse, because you're not being validated for your reality, and obviously everyone has a right to be validated for their own reality. It's abusive and psychologically abusive. So this can create a sense of disassociation, because I think the idea of disassociation can come when there's something too overwhelming. I'm not a psychologist, but I know that obviously if you're disassociating, something can be too overwhelming for you to deal with and cope with, obviously if you're being consistently psychologically abused, this is very overwhelming, and you can disassociate from yourself. If you're being consistently manipulated and told you're being loved when you're actually, the actions don't align, you could be very confused and therefore disassociate from the situation, because you either don't know how to cope, or you can feel like it gives you an escape from being manipulated, or you don't want to engage in the felt sense of love, which you keep being pushed to keep you in this trauma bond cycle. That's also how trauma bonds are formed, when you have a positive interaction, and then a negative interaction, then a positive interaction, then a negative interaction, then a negative interaction, then a positive interaction, and it keeps going like that. This becomes a trauma bond, because your mind becomes bonded to the person in a positive way, but then is being abused at the same time, so it becomes this push and pull. And that's how narcissists operate often, draw you in, oh, let's go out, let's have a great time, blah, 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 and then abuse occurs and they start psychologically attacking you. That is a trauma bond relationship, and it's not a healthy relationship, it's an abusive relationship. So that's disassociation, that can come from that. Also, what can cause disassociation is a sense of the affective personality type of a psychopath, especially psychopathic caregiver, which can also evoke fear and shame. All of this can evoke fear and shame, apparently. Which is also what they want, because of a sense of... One sec. Okay, so yeah, the next thing is the affective behaviour of psychopathic parents, which is a lack of remorse, a lack of empathy, which can cause confusion. So because of obviously the nature of narcissism, empath and dark triad traits, So yes, this creates confusion because of psychopaths and narcissists' inability to show remorse and empathy in general, because they have very low levels of it. We just know because of the psychology behind it. It can create a sense of confusion because obviously from a healthy person's mind you're going to be like, how can they be so horrible and nasty and manipulative and show so little remorse for their, you know, the detriment of their decisions, and show such little empathy towards my, you know, maltreatment or situation that is negative, which might not even involve them. And can create a sense of confusion for this reason, and also disassociation if you're not being supported and validated for your experience. And also, psychopaths have shallow affect, which means they don't feel depth of emotion, which can also be very confusing, and fail to accept responsibility for themselves, which creates a sense of guilt because you then, especially as a child, which is what I'm talking about mainly, but can carry through as an adult. As I said, when you have these core beliefs that you have to manage psychopaths or tolerate them to an extent, you'll have this level of guilt potentially as an adult also when this happens, or obviously you can just be a bit smarter, but you can still have this sense potentially, if not processed, of guilt when someone doesn't accept responsibility because of like your mind trying to make sense of the situation, and just a level of self-blame because you might think because of their shallow affect you're not being met at your healthy emotional depth, of like a person with a full range of healthy emotion. You also might be told that you're overly emotional by a person with shallow affect because obviously it doesn't make sense to them that you feel a sense of happiness and joy at times for prolonged periods, and for a range of emotions that they don't understand, because often their emotions are mainly based around anger and sort of irritability around various things. And psychopaths, they're, you know, very agitated a lot of the time. It can bring a level of self-blame because you might think they're not validating my experience, I'm not being emotionally supported, because they can't emotionally support you because obviously they don't feel your sense of emotion, they can't empathise with it because they don't have it themselves, and also they have a shallow affect of the emotion they even feel within themselves. So you have this level of self-blame, like it's my fault that I'm not being emotionally validated, or like some sense of like it will be better if I was better, then I would be emotionally validated, and it's just not the case because they cannot emotionally validate you, and they don't want to anyway because they want to keep you in compliance, and they don't want you to be healthy and grow because you would then not be subservient to them and validate their godlike ego. So then in a sense of life, psychopaths need stimulation, which can also be related to how because they have extremely dull senses of self because of their shallow affect and obviously lack of ability to connect to other people in a genuine way. They need stimulation consistently, and they're obviously dysregulated minds. They need stimulation. They're often very parasitic, lack goals, they're impulsive and irresponsible, which creates a sense of chaos, neglect, poverty. If someone's obviously very irresponsible, it's easy to assume that they can be neglectful of children. If they need stimulation, they can often antagonise children to create chaos. If they're impulsive, also it can be related to frequent moves of house. Also, if they're impulsive, they could have easily pissed off a neighbour or something, which can make them have a negative experience with their housing situation, so they might want to move. If they lack goals, again, it can create a sense of poverty if they don't want to work. Or if they're impulsive and they spend all the money, for example, it can create a sense of poverty. Obviously not everyone in poverty has an impulsive sense. That's not what I'm saying, but it's a case of an irresponsibility, again, chaos because of maybe arguments with other people or arguments with children, or just irresponsible behaviour. Drinking a lot of alcohol around children and whatever can bring a real sense of chaos. It's extremely scary, and this creates then conflict in the mind. So just to compare, as I said, I didn't really go back to the fact that you disassociate with the affective senses of lack of remorse, lack of empathy, and the confusion this creates, and the self-blame, and the shallow affect, and the guilt, and the failure to accept responsibility. That creates disassociation because obviously it's really confusing to get your mind around And obviously it's just not something you want to feel. I think a sense of disassociation can come from a level of, obviously, as I said, I'm not a psychologist, not claiming to be, but it's a case of logically you'd think you'd disassociate because, as a child especially, because obviously you don't want to feel those senses of self-blame and confusion and guilt. And I think it's a sense of like trying to short-wire yourself because you know obviously the guilt is not valid. If you think about it logically, I think on some level, even as a child, you know logically that obviously the confusion is not necessary, the self-blame is not valid, the guilt is not valid, because you know that it's the fault was in the parent. But obviously because of your need and dependence on them, as you should as a child, or not having that validation or support in the past to build yourself as a child, because you're only supposed to be really dependent on an adult, I think, from a young age, and then you're supposed to be built up to be an autonomous person. But if you're kept in compliance and sort of consistently traumatized by psychopaths and put into confusion, self-blame and guilt, because a psychopath is unable to accept responsibility for themselves, you're kept in this compliant, dependent situation, which can then cause disassociation because you don't want to be in that situation. Just to leave that in there. So it can bring a sense of conflict when you're in obviously poverty, chaos and neglect, or irresponsibility. I suppose just because you're trying to come to how you can resolve that, and you might become sort of stuck. Not stuck necessarily, obviously stuck in the situation, but you might become very conflicted about, obviously you want to be out of neglect, you want to be out of chaos, you want to be out of poverty, but obviously you're stuck in that living situation with the toxic person, toxic parent, a toxic caregiver who needs stimulation, who needs who is irresponsible, who is parasitic. And obviously that creates this sense of neglect because you're sort of toing and froing between this sense of, I want to be financially secure, but my parent keeps spending all the money that I'm getting from the government, or that they should be spending on me, so I'm therefore not able to eat, therefore I'm in poverty, which is really serious. Obviously this is why when it's really serious like that, there's obviously, you need to tell someone. But I don't want to talk about people not being able to eat because that's a whole other level. But obviously it doesn't have to be like to the extent that you don't need to eat. It's just a sense of obviously chaos. It can come about even if you're being fed meals, which most hopefully people are, but it's a case of even a level of and it can come in all socioeconomic classes. The people don't have to be obviously in a lower socioeconomic class to have psychopaths. I think to be a psychopath, psychopaths are very prevalent in as CEOs and stuff because of their lack of remorse and empathy, so it can make them quite apparently solid business people because they don't really care to beat around the bush or make a good deal for the other person, and they're very charming, so you can do business deals quite easily. But yeah, so then the last part is which also evokes fear and shame. All of this evokes fear and shame, which the toxic person does want you to be in because they have this consistent level of cage of fear and shame within themselves. Fear of being rejected as narcissists, or which they inevitably are because they're toxic people that can't relate in a healthy way to other people at all, and also a level of shame because of their inadequacy that they feel even within themselves, that they try and project on other people, and obviously then the rejection that comes from this. My laptop's about to run out again. So yes, but then the last portion, which I'm going to just put my laptop down here because it has to charge, is antisocial portion of psychopathy, which is, and specifically parental psychopathy, which can also cause conflict, and this is delinquency, early behavioural problems, poor behavioural control. This can cause genetic risk because if a parent is delinquent, has early behavioural problems, or has behavioural control issues, obviously this can put the child at risk of physical harm, and therefore genetic risk because of the stress that is endured by antagonization of a toxic person due to delinquency of, be that a parent trying to get a child into things like drugs or stealing, which can cause risk, and obviously then stress because of the impact of that, and because of the impact of the law of that, or if they have poor behavioural controls, as I said, it can be related to physical abuse, which is another thing, and criminal versatility, and then this thing called revocation of release, which is basically not following through with your promises. A massive thing in narcissism is future faking, and that's a sense of like promising things will get better, dangling this carrot over a person's face, especially a child. A child's not going to know any different, especially when they have isolation from other people, which again toxic people like you to have, because they want to feel that sense of isolation that they inevitably have from other people because they're toxic, to feel less so. They try and evoke that sense of isolation within a child. They have this sense of revocation of release, aka not following through with promises, which can create parental absence, because you know, if a child is very compliant, is very dependent on an adult, and then the adult is like, oh, I'll come to your school disco or whatever, or your birthday party, and then says, oh, I'm not coming to your birthday party. Obviously, I don't know how, you know, I don't know whether birthday parties are difficult, because obviously how does a child can have a birthday party? Okay, so just say, you know, say school event, a parent says they're going to come to a school event, and then they decide last minute they don't, and that lets the child down. That then creates parental absence, which creates a sense of conflict, because see, you want your parent to come to that school event, but then obviously the parent is not doing that, so it creates a conflict, because you're then like, obviously, what can I do? Obviously the child knows logically there's nothing that they've done to cause that, hopefully, unless they've been really messed up to the point where they're really self-blaming themselves already. But it can just be really confusing and conflicting for the child, because they're like, there's nothing I can do, and that can bring a sense, just to add as well, of inability to feel that they have control over a situation. If they're not able to change a toxic parent into the parent that they want or need, which obviously you can't anyway as a child, it can bring this inevitable core sense of I'm unable to control my situation, I'm out of control in life, because obviously I don't have impact on other people or impact on life, because I'm unable to impact my toxic parent. It can just be a real not vicious cycle, kind of vicious cycle, but like a very deeply ingrained belief that can come to a child through obviously this situation, because a child can be very persistent at trying to obviously with things like future faking and revocation of release and stuff, aka not following through with their plans even though they're promised that they will. You can get this sense of I can keep trying, and this is the idea of being on a toxic person's hamster wheel, which a child will inevitably be on until they decide to move away. Even as a healthy adult, you know, it even comes to that point of processing that childhood trauma to be able to fully release it from the system, and then obviously deal with that. So yeah, I'm going to just leave it there, because I've had to like delete so many videos in order to actually finish this one, and delete loads of stuff on my phone. Thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.